And with us, our special guest, Mark Palmer, who's going to blow your minds, the scientist, the mind. We're going to meet the mind behind the man. Mark Palmer today of Higher Direction. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, Moving the Rock is all about transforming leadership insights into growth momentum. And what I love about what you do is you help us actually bring data science, validated insights to our job, which in the sales and leadership world, so much of that is not science-based. So much of it is made up as we go. So you bring some sanity to the world. Before we jump into it, I'd love it if maybe you could just introduce yourself to our listeners, give us some background. I know you've got a varied background, but how did your career trajectory get you to where you are today?
How much time we have? I'll give you the condensed version. So my background's in social and behavioral science, data and analytics, and organizational design. So it's just this weird combination of fields and studies and structures that really led to kind of where we are today. And I was very fortunate because organizational science was going through a lot of changes in terms of its applicability to business, and data was really just getting off the ground in terms of having a better ability to tell stories that were compelling about what we're seeing in terms of what organizations are doing. And leadership started to take off as well, leadership and organizational design. We just started asking a lot of questions around 2000, and with the boom in technology and the progress we made in technology, it really all was just a perfect storm. I was very lucky to get in on the ground floor of that. And so, it's been 20 years plus where, this combination of theory and science and data and really developing practical approaches and modeling to figure out, why do organizations do what they do, what's successful, what works, what's the relationship between how organizations function and people's talents, and what are the best way to harness those talents in any given situation. So sales and IT and business practices of all types, quality assurance and compliance, you name it. So like I said, I was lucky to get on that ground floor, and that's where we are today.
And like all lucky people, 15-hour days don't hurt.
Yeah. My 10,000 hours of practice, on top of a healthy dose of insanity and being at the right place at the right time, talk about perfect storm. So yeah, I've been very fortunate, and a little bit of madness, a little bit of passion, and I put in my 10,000 hours and continue to do so. I'm just happy to love what I do, and I'm very passionate about this stuff. So this is exciting.
Cool. It makes me curious if there's any kind of origin story for you that got you so passionate about computer and data science and how all that.
It's maybe a spider bite somewhere or something.
That's right. Yeah, there's some kind of anticlimactic origin story. Uncle, I didn't get bit by the spider in the lab or anything. I really did just sort of just fall into what I was into, and it took me another 5 years to figure out, this stuff could be important. So yeah, anticlimactic origin story.
So no girl in the 5th grade was like, Mark, if you knew how to do computer science math, maybe. I'd have to sit on the therapist chair to kind of dig that out. I don't know. There may be a story yet to come. We'll have to see. We'll have to play it out. There you go.
We can explore that, man. We have lots of episodes coming up. We can sign you up.
That's right.
And Chris is great on the therapy side for sure.
Okay.
And tough questions you don't want to answer, especially on a live broadcast.
I'll cash that in later, Chris.
Yeah. Well, so let's deliver on the promise, right? So we've got people kind of thinking about what the hell these guys talking about: data insights, behaviors, organizational development, and driving, delivering potential. So narrow us in on what you've got today, the science behind what you've got today, and then and I'd love to hear about well, the problem that you set out to solve that kind of led to this latest development that you have?
Yeah. So, in a nutshell, what's the big deal about data? In a nutshell, data helps us tell stories. It gives us some insight about what's going on, why things are happening. And in my background with data, I got to experiment with a lot of different things. I got to experiment with data as it pertains to operations. So things being efficient, effective, productive. So I got to look at productivity. I dealt with data in logistics, and where you can get a lot of predictive power about on-time delivery, that kind of thing. I looked at data in terms of, I have a background in looking at location analysis when, we're building commercial real estate properties. So I was also involved with geographic information systems and building models to predict why some locations, whether it's quick service restaurants or it's, some other commercial real estate property does well and others don't. So I got to see a lot of different fields, tell a lot of different stories and figure things out. And one thing I noticed in all of this, being in the organizational science, is that there were no metrics for people in terms of how people worked. So you've got all these advances in finance, in fintech, you've got all these advances in operations and being more productive and more efficient, and logistics, and technology has really progressed those fields. But I was talking to an HR exec years ago, and he said, you know what, Mark, the space around HR and the way we look at people and the way we assess talent, that hasn't changed in 70 years. I mean, think about that. 70 years, 7-0. That hasn't changed in 70 years. But you've got all this change, even since 2000, from a technology standpoint, around all these other areas that are really impactful for the business. And if you think about the relationship of HR to the rest of the organization, HR is, sort of the heel of the other departments. It's looked at as a cost center. It's not a profit center. It doesn't, there's not the perception that it has the same strategic value. And I've always wondered why that is. And then when I started looking at applying data to HR and human capital management and, around people's roles and talents, I just quickly realized, like, you know what? Out of all these different fields, HR is the only one that hasn't progressed. That's a big problem. I mean, data is solving all these other issues, but why not here?
So, Mark, I gotta stop you, man, because I mean, Chris and I, we've all been living in this world of assessments, right? Personality, behavior, aptitude, attitude, skill assessments. What do you mean, we haven't been able to measure people for 70 years? Get deeper into that for us, because that I can just hear the people, the minds, and I can see people's foreheads, they're furrowing. What do you mean, man? What's going on?
Well, there's a couple of things there. It's a great question. A couple of things. First of all, those different fields have what we call quantitative data, right? They're numbers. It's things that can be measurable. So, measurable in the same way are HR measurables in terms of people's talents and looking at assessment and personality. Are they quantitative in the way that you can look at, margins, and you can look at, time efficiencies and productivities and things like that? Those are all quantitative measures. In HR, you've got qualitative measures. So you have instruments, but two issues with those instruments. How do you measure personality? It's a qualitative measure on one hand. And on the second, okay, this is what we're going to use to see if people fit into certain work roles and if they're good at certain things. How do you relate that to work requirements, to job requirements, to organizational requirements? How do you tie that in a one-to-one way? With productivity, I can look at productivity numbers and I can look at what a person's doing in terms of, certain output. And I get one piece of information, but how do I say, well, this person's introverted, so that It's going to be predictive of their productivity or efficiency. So in HR, things haven't changed for decades. And so what's used as a measurable is the only thing that we know about people, which is related to the psychosocial sciences. And a lot of those models, personality models, what we call characterological models, they look at these personality traits. They're not related to job requirements. And by and large, those models haven't changed in about 60 to 70 years. So we're using a lot of the same science that came out of the 40s and 50s when organizational science was born, and it hasn't really changed all that much. So we're using antiquated metrics, but also we're using qualitative metrics. And so we don't get the same quantitative predictive power that you're going to get in logistics, in finance, in operations. You're not going to get that same thing. So what seemed to be missing from my perspective and our perspective, higher direction, was, you know what? We don't have a really good quantitative metric that describes people's talents, that describes what people are good at. Now, we still have some good directional tools, skill. Of course, the problem is what level of skill? How do you describe skill? So part of this is how we define metrics in the first place. What metrics are good? Are we looking at lagging metrics? Things that we see after the fact? Are there leading metrics that we can define out of this? So also missing is this an entire exercise around defining what metrics are actually meaningful as it pertains to people's talents. So we don't have that yet. And so that's been the missing, that's been the missing link. So if I want to know if a person's good for a sales job or an operations job or a finance job, all I have today is, okay, I've got a resume that says, well, they took finance, and I have a personality test.
Right.
But what does character have to do with the job?
And you have the kind of the experience, right, of the hiring manager who only hires a certain type of personality for a certain type of role because their experience tells them they have a higher probability of being successful.
Exactly. So now you're at the subjective bias of also the hiring person, because typically, and it's human nature, when it comes to people, we hire people like us, or we're very heavily biased by our own perceptions. So we don't use a data-based approach. We use a very subjective approach, and there's no data science behind it. So it's all gut, or it's very, very mostly gut. So we have this sort of vacuum in, even if we know if a person has a certain background, what's their application of that background in a particular field? So if I want to hire a programmer and I say, well, this person has C++, knows Java, Python, whatever, Ruby on Rails. Well, how do I know if they're going to be successful in the role that I have? Right. So there's questions unanswered in terms of the application and the way that people are applying their talents and their knowledge that's configurable and applicable to job requirements and what the organization needs. There's not that one-to-one ratio. And so that's what we determined is kind of missing out in the field today.
Gotcha. So I was curious, Chris, how does this land on you, man, given the background you have dealing with leaders and organizations of all types?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just so fascinating because the psychosocial piece, that's the current innovation in HR, just more methods that are being adopted, more measurements, I should say. And what's fascinating to me is just like, you took what is hampered by gut and built a tool that is going to make a lot of consulting not needed in a great way. I mean, that's what powerful software and data does. It displaces a lot of work and employment, and it gets replaced somewhere else, the yin yang of it all. But like, I can think of the number of companies that I've worked with where you're just in the meeting and you're like, that person does not need to be in that role. They do not need to have that responsibility. Oh, they could be there. It's just a fresh set of eyes. I think if somebody has a fresh set of eyes, a lot of experience, a really honed intuition that isn't informed by their anxiety or their own bias, and they've got some bias, everybody does, they're going to be an effective tool. to someone. And there are times I've done that. I mean, you walk a company through and it's like, you don't need to be a CEO, you need to be a COO, whatever, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But to hear what you've put together and to experience it as I went through it and see how it creates this composite picture and places you, it's the whole piece. And I don't even know how, I mean, my mind tends to be creative and attack novel problems. I don't even know how you had the imagination to almost, are you familiar with Charles Kuhn, where he talks about how scientific breakthrough happens a box at a time? You leapt into a new box with this.
Yeah.
We do like to talk about, that's interesting, Chris, because we do talk about internally at Higher Direction, we talk about what we call an alternative paradigm. And that this is, part of the opportunity and challenge is that paradigmatically, or from a new paradigm standpoint, this is a different way to think about human capability altogether. And what we're trying to do is quantify human capability. And so that means we had to learn from other fields like human biology that looked at patterns. And so everything from physics to biology to evolutionary psychology looks at patterns. So things can be configured, even the way people think, what in the organization sciences or in the social sciences we call constructs. It's the way people make sense. It's sense making. It's a sense making process. And the way people make sense of the world can be broken down into different buckets, into constructs. People are constructing the world. It's a co-creative process where a certain group of people agree that, hey, this is reality. This is reality. It's very black and white. It's linear. Things are defined. That's what reality is. On the other end of that, on a more creative side, reality is what if. It's potentiating. It's, possibility. It's abstract. It's nonlinear. It's discursive, right? These are two poles of how people make meaning. So if you out in the population, we can start to get this spectrum of the way people are looking at the world, making meaning it and defining it in very similar ways. So you start to get these little buckets. Well, if you apply that in the context of work, what you see is in the organization, what the organization has to do to survive requires everything in that continuum. I need really solid internal stuff like administration and productivity and quality and process. And I need external facing stuff like positioning, competitive positioning, brand identity. Who are we in the market? It's external, it's facing the market. So I need stuff internal to my own operating as an organization. And I need stuff outside facing to be competitive with other companies that I'm tangential to and that I'm also relating to at a customer level. Well, that gives us a whole backdrop and a framework to start to talk about people's capability in a way that matches that. So when you start defining it that way, you go, wait a minute, then capability is somehow related to how people are channeling the way that they make sense of the work world. And that's what they focus on and what they're typically good at. And so when you start going to the organizational sciences, that's exactly what we find. And so the science behind GMI is based on the fact that there's a relationship between the organization's realities, its structures and functions, and people's capabilities in terms of how they channel their experience and they channel their preferences and how they make sense, what we call operational sense making, how they make sense of the work world. There's a relationship there. And so it's like, we've got a data point, got something to measure with, got something to work with.
So, yes, I'm sorry, Chris, I stepped on you, man.
No, I was going to say, Jimmy, it makes me think of what we talk about with like, when you're taking leaders through transformation, there's a movie playing in their heads.
Right.
Not the movie playing in somebody else's head. And at a neuroscientific level, if I could be in Jimmy's brain right now, I would feel like I'm tripping drugs because because his reality construct is so different than mine. And, so, when he's saying that, Jimmy, it makes me think of the application there and too much is firing off.
Well, I want to kind of I'm used to this with dealing with Mark, right? Because Mark is like that scientist who's way out there, and the rest of us have to make sense of it. Like, it's like having the two of you on this podcast at the same time is what's stressing me out, man. I feel like I gotta be the interpreter.
I'm trying to hold back, Jimmy.
But no, but if I had to summarize what I'm hearing, it's like the problem is, HR and the understanding of human behavior hasn't changed much. And when we start thinking about how do we understand personality, and those formulas like DISC and Myers-Briggs and all those, they existed out there and been reused and rehashed, but it's the same technology reused over and over again to measure the same thing. Different views of personality, which is not quantitative, it's qualitative. It's not predictive. It's a tool that can give us insight on a probability, but it doesn't give us the same insight into business process and performance that measuring a data point does. A predictive, scientifically created, quantitative, not qualitative, data point does. And so what HR folks are looking for is, how do I understand people at a data level? So what you've done, it sounds like, is you've replaced gut, right? Or my kind of worldview, experiential sense of what it means to have this type of person and match them to a role. Instead of using gut, we can replace that with an algorithm, something that can scientifically identify the patterns you're talking about, and not like figure us out, but just express our mindset, the way we view the world, the way that we approach work, express that as a data point, or in your case, 150 data points that represent a pattern and that allow us to then create fit the right person in the right role. Is that essentially where we are?
That's precisely it. In the 40s and 50s, basically systems theory was born. And systems theory came out of social scientists that were looking at what was happening in the evolutionary biology world, and evolutionary biologists, Luhmann, and there were a bunch of them that were looking at, again, they were looking at patterns. They were looking at how does biology behave. And so that inspired social scientists to start looking at social systems that way. And it inspired organization scientists to start emulating social scientists and saying, well, there's some organismic stuff happening here too. So there was a science that was born in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and it really focused on the functioning of organizations. And the theoretical basis of this was called structural functionalism, or just functionalism for short. And it looked at the organization, the levels of the organization, and there were a few individuals in particular, I'm thinking maybe Deming and Elliot Jacques, that said, well, for the administrative parts of the organization, then people are going to have the ideal logic is going to be this and so forth. And then there's a time span component to it, that as you go up the organization and the complexity of role increases, then the time span also increases. So the CEO has to have a 60-year time frame. That science basically got lost in the early 70s with postmodernism, when we started focusing less on the organization and started focusing on cultures and people. And so it's basically buried stuff. So what we tried to do is say, okay, is there an ability to take the best of that, what came out of that era of organization science? It's basically lost. Nobody's using it anymore, but it's the closest we had to really something quantifiable. And can we marry that with the best that we've learned about organization cultures and so forth? And so what we teased out of that, to your point, Jimmy, was something around alignment. And this notion of alignment is what the organization is trying to do with all of its different functions, and how a person is making sense of the world. And those things line up at a certain threshold, you've got bingo, you've got top line fit.
Right.
And when they're dissonant, you got a bad fit. So now we've got a framework: organization, capability, what's the relationship? Got a framework now. Because of that framework now, that's where we build our data on. That's the foundation of building the data on. So there's existing science on this. It's just been buried for a long time, but There's decades of research on this. And so, we're standing on the shoulders of that. And obviously during that time, the one thing that they didn't figure in was that time would become less obsolete, accelerated by technology. So we take the factor of time out. That's because this time horizons get shorter as technology progresses and gets more complex. But what changes is complexity. Abstraction changes. So we're seeing that. So that's just an additional factor in there. But by and large, this is what the science behind GMI is about. It's about this relationship between the functioning of the organization and people's capability and how aligned people are to those functions. And that's the basis of it all.
Could I sum it up this way? It's the combination of placement and fit, like placement in the role, fit in the organization with the existing people that are there, right?
Yes, that's right, Chris, because once you start and you're actually touching on something that at a root level, if we can figure out alignment at a root level, at an individual level, then you start asking, well, what happens when you intermingle a bunch of different types of alignment? What kind of culture do you have?
Right.
What kind of diversity do you have? But we're talking about operational diversity. We're talking about operational culture because we're talking about different types of alignment. We have alignment with people that are better for organizational functions that relate to administration versus analysis versus design versus, more conceptual things. And you got a group of those people all at the same time. So placement on a team becomes all of a sudden a different way to look at that because it's like, oh, wow, our team culture is really administrative. So now we're not talking about, what some would consider more woo-woo factors. We're talking about what people value, because that's what culture is. Part of culture is values and norms. What people value in terms of how they're defining success, progress, who's valuable. If you're in a culture, if you're in an operational culture that values internal process language, tactical stuff, very concrete stuff, but you're an idea person, you're not a good fit for that culture.
Right.
Right? So instead of now we're looking at this from an operational alignment perspective, OA, operational alignment. Do the alignments fit? So now that's an additional question we can ask, but it's all based off of this individual alignment. And then once we figure that out, we can start scaling this thing out. You can get the DNA of entire organizations. So it's like, wow. Now we have the ability to ask very, very different questions in a much more impactful way. And it's a different way of talking about culture. It's a different way of talking about diversity. And so placement now has a whole different tenor to it than some of the, more traditional ways of looking at this stuff.
Well, because the traditional way favors, Jimmy, wouldn't you say you've seen this? Whoever can come in and be the most influential and persuasive.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So
either by because of their authority or because of their personality or some combination. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you hope to get lucky, right? Do I have the right combination of the right person to do that?
We rely on likability, right?
Right.
Natural human instinct. And again, the human sciences and organizations had, those fields haven't changed in 70 years. So what do you have? You've got likability, which, really, if you think about it, it's interesting that they use personality assessments because it's around likability. So you're looking for some degree of chemistry, and there's a use for that. But is the right use for that placing someone in a particular role where you're looking at a certain level of job requirements? Would you use personality to build job requirements?
Right.
So why would you use personality to assess somebody's fit to job requirements? Right. So we just start asking questions that until you pick it apart that way, you don't think about it. But when you start framing it that way, you go, oh, no, I'd never build a job based off of, personality traits. I would build a job based off the requirements. And it's a different way of doing things.
So
go ahead, Jimmy.
Wow, man, sorry about that. What you're saying to me is, look, the answer to the question is no, we wouldn't, but it's all we got, right? People feel like it's all we got. Plus, no, we wouldn't, but the hiring manager probably believes in his or her ability to kind of use their gut and figure this out. And this is a black box or or a some voodoo that I've built over my career that makes me uniquely qualified to be a a hiring manager.
Right.
But what you're talking about is, I mean, Chris, I'm seeing this as a tool, and I'm seeing this, and we've been using this, but this is the first time this has kind of come through to me. I'm seeing this as a tool that really empowers, back to the beginning, HR, right? The human resource professional can now bring science to and value to the business unit owner's challenge, which is, how do I create alignment between the goal, the role, and the person? And then how do I scale that to a team? And then how do I scale that to a agile and resilient organization that can survive the changes the market brings to me? COVID. Now we're looking forward to 2021. How do we respond?
Yeah.
And it really helped me make sense of, scientific sense of, database sense of the decisions that I have to make. And I can de-emphasize the gut, and I can emphasize maybe, more quantitative decision making. And that makes HR wildly valuable, and a tremendous partner to the business unit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So often HR only knows how to play defense. If they do play offense, it's just the psychosocial measurements.
Yeah.
That's where they're trying to add value. And what this confronts is any leader whose calibration is even 1 degree off and feels an anxiety in their leadership, even just 1 degree, they hire leaders that satiate those anxieties, that mirror their personality, that comfort things within them. And what a powerful mirror this is for them to see the traps they would fall into, that they would want those things satiated, rather than saying, you know what, that person might bring out something in my wiring, defense mechanisms, or whatever, that is the worst of me. But that's who needs to be in that role. And I got to grow past that. Right. Have you seen that to play out in scenarios?
Well, it's really interesting, because what you're alluding to, and what you're both alluding to, is we call these 2 traps likability and heroics.
Okay.
That's what we favor. We favor likability, which I mentioned. We also favor heroics, rather than focusing on the organizational goal and need, the requirements that would support that need, and then a person's capability that then fit those requirements, right? So that 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, Jimmy, you said it, right? Goals, roles, talent, goals, roles, capability. They focus on, do I like the person? And so there's a comfort level, Chris, that's what you're alluding to. So likability and heroics, which means we rely on the person to overcome anything. There's just this perception that people just have, it's a hero complex. And what this starts to do then is take people down a path where it causes deeper systemic problems at the organization level. And I'll give you an example. So if I'm focusing on likability and heroics, and I'm sort of using that as a way to comfort, my defenses and sort of pay that psychological, softening. Mm-hmm. I'm not focused on what the role actually needs to be and the work required to actually calibrate the role to the function, and the function that supports a specific organizational goal, all which in today's markets change constantly. So to be agile, I have to have a clear goal and strategies. I have to set up organization functions that support those. I have to set up job requirements that support those. And I have to put people in those job requirements whose operational alignment fit those requirements. That's the sequence, right? It's what we call talent reliability engineering. Now, without that, I start doing things like I don't pay attention to the role because I'm focused on likability and heroics. Well, a lot of times you get problems like the role's not properly defined. If the role's not properly defined, how would you ever know if anybody can be successful in the role? Mm-hmm. You don't know what the role is. You've never actually gone down the path from a functional standpoint of clearly defining the requirements, what we call the key performance objectives of the role. So there's not a breakdown of the role in such a way that you can even assess whether somebody fits the role. Right. So now you could be causing problems in the role, what we call role creep or too much role bandwidth, where you have competing capability styles, competing alignment styles in there, so competing performance on mindsets.
So Mark, what something that's ringing true to me here is so the hiring manager who's leveraging gut and focusing on likability and heroics, right? They're the folks that are basically would be more comfortable saying, here's your computer, here's your desk, go get them, Tiger.
Yes, exactly.
Figure it out.
That's it.
And so we're replacing that instead of mapping people to my sense of what's important in terms of likability and heroics and their ability to make my life easier as a hiring manager, but by allowing me just to say, go figure it out. Instead of matching to that, we're saying, look, you have a goal, build the proper team, identify the role definitions, and let's match people to the role definition. How about that? Exactly. If you want to optimize performance, let's do that.
That's right. You don't change people because people by and large don't change. We're hardwired in a very certain way. We adapt in a very certain, in limited ways, but we are who we are. So it's a focus not on changing people, but on adapting systems and then putting people where they can be successful based off of those system requirements. It's a win-win. It's a win in terms of what the organization can get done. And it's a win in terms of the professionals, performance, self-confidence, because we're putting them in areas where they can thrive. So we're looking for thrivability. So it's a different focus. We're not focused on changing people. We adapt systems. We change systems to meet the adaptations in the environment, and then we can place people. So that's kind of this 1-2 punch. Adapt my system, then assess for fit. Always. And you go back to the drawing board over and over and over because the environment's changing. So you may have a transformation of identity. Take IBM, for example, who was product focused for years and years. Then they said, well, we're going to focus on services. That's a huge transformation. That's a brand transformation. That invariably affects your workforce. So then your workforce has to adapt to that as well. With this type of approach, if that becomes your new strategy in the marketplace, our identity is going to change. That means our functions as an organization change. Our processes are going to change. Our job roles are going to change. How then do we reshuffle the deck of our people to put them in places where they can be thriving and be winning, and the organization can deliver on its goals? And so the approach, that 1-2 punch approach, not taking that is the reason why a lot of organization change management efforts fail, total quality management efforts fail, projects fail. I mean, think about the failure rate of all this stuff. It's somewhere around 90% plus.
Right.
And it's because we focus on people and we don't really focus on, well, how is the system adapting to what our strategy is in the marketplace? And then how do the people fit that system? But we don't have that today, right? So changing the paradigm, it's a switch, but it's a very effective switch, and it follows the patterns of some of these other fields that have really progressed because of technology. They have these advanced measurables, and they can do a lot of things with data, like tell stories. We can tell stories about fit. We can say, this is what your DNA is as an organization. You are in a growth mode. You are in a stability mode. You are in a realignment mode. Here's what you need for successful M&A. I can tell you the DNA, the operational DNA of this culture, operational DNA of this culture. This is where people are. This is the configuration that's going to be most successful. We can provide that prescriptive guidance, but it's a quantitative thing. It's very measurable things, because we can measure the DNA of a role and say, look, the role needs to be this because the function's this. So the role is X% design process. It's going to have, but this 5% administration. Well, who fits that? Who out in our staff fits that? Oh, Karen fits that perfectly. Great. She's her thrivability level, her alignment fit is 89%, because she fits all the different things, the key performance objectives of the job, in a way that match her DNA. We can see that, and we can go up the scale.
Mark, if here, a really serious question here. Do you know anybody ever that you've been connected to that in a good way made healthy changes? I agree with you. Most humans don't change. Do you know any human that you can think of that you said they made some really good changes?
That's a great question.
It's a leading question. I have somewhere I'm headed, and I'm okay admitting that.
To the extent that I've seen meaningful adaptations, I've seen some leaders have an instinct about their business, and even though they were hiring off of similar disposition, they were inadvertently choosing operational alignment, so not intentionally. So that's where I've seen it.
Well, and so here's my suspicion, and I'd be curious to have you confirm or shoot it down. You get placement and fit dialed in, then you get the ego, the insecurities, the anxieties out of the way. It increases the likelihood for a greater transformational arc, right?
Absolutely.
For the leaders to be transformed personally. Right. That's, what I've seen is we can, as you've cracked the code placement and fit, what Jimmy and I work on, we've cracked the code on how a leader changes. We know. I can look any leader in the eyeball and say, if you want to grow, I can completely change how you process every event in your life.
Right.
No doubt about it. But if I put you in an environment that placement and fit are off, you're going to have natural frustrations. You're going to have irritations. You're going to have things that block you up. So if I can get your placement and fit dialed in, then walk you through a pathway of transformation. Business isn't just business for business sake. It's what Jimmy and I talk about a lot. Instead, it's the vehicle for human transformation.
Right.
Because our institutions aren't going to do it. They're too old and failing.
That's right.
Yeah. Jimmy, what do you seeing where I'm headed with that? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it's totally cool. It's totally makes total sense. And Chris, and Mark, Chris and I have built this accelerator model that focuses on leaders, teams, culture, and action, right? These 4 primary steps. And how do you achieve that? And what we've been playing with regard to the technology you bring to the table, the GMI, is this idea of 2 things: doing exactly what you suggested, creating operational alignment for the organization, right? Understanding how roles and goals align and role definitions. And then to Chris's, and so that expands the potential of the organization. And what's amazing is it identifies gaps, it eliminates gaps, and it eliminates barriers that folks look at and say, why does it exist? How can we ever get rid of that? And then instead of saying, let's work on it, they just accept it as a limitation of the business.
Right.
We can get rid of those limitations of the business, those perceived limitations of the business. Mm-hmm. And then when you put the right person in the right role, you eliminate perceived limitations of the individual. You now have a human being who is, think of examples of people who just found their calling. The 16-year-old who found the piano, and we call them a protege, or a prodigy. Excuse me. We call them a prodigy. Think of the person who stumbled over technology and then built, Apple computer. These people who stumble into perfect fit, right. And now we can actually help people get there. So you're expanding the potential of the organization, expanding the potential of the individuals in the organization, and wherever we've applied this, the results have been remarkable.
Yeah.
But now we know why. Now we've sat through with this for 40 minutes.
Right.
Here's the science behind it, which is pretty cool.
You guys do it instinctually, and you understand that there are these friction points and drag coefficients that we just sort of accept come with the territory, but they can be minimized incredibly by this type of science. And then what you do very naturally, intuitively, now and Chris, to your point, you can walk through the transformative arc incredibly effectively because you've taken out a lot of those friction points, which are just misalignments, right? It's just what we look at as called operational dissonance and misalignment. We minimize those, people can grow. People can adapt. But for a long time, people weren't identifying those friction points properly. They were mislabeling them and saying, calling them things like lack of motivation. Well, motivation is an outcome. If I'm creative and you put me in and I've got a rubber stamp stuff, I'm not going to be very motivated, right? This is simple stuff, but it's a shift in the way we look at some of these things that we've been trying to measure. I'm not going to measure motivation. Motivation is an indicator that I'm aligned or I'm not. So it's a whole different emphasis. So things like engagement, motivation, curiosity, and learning are really dependent on alignment. Alignment's been the missing key. All those factors go up and down as my alignment goes up and down. So it's just a different type of focus. And, with what you guys do and the science behind this, it's a killer combination. That's why I get excited, because I can just say, hey, here's the science. You guys can go kill it and do what you naturally do. That's fun.
And now really, you can empower organizations as well, not just guys like Chris and I, but you can empower business unit owners and HR directors and HR leaders to now have a common language that they can use to now, work together and work more effectively together, which I think is just tremendous.
That's a good way to look at it, Jimmy. We talk about the fact that there isn't a language, a data language that can really illuminate and reveal friction points, misalignments, opportunities for alignments where the existing ones are. Now you can do a SWOT analysis that means something, a gap analysis that really means something, because now you're framing that in terms of alignment and misalignment. So on the people side of the fence, now you've got something that's just as compelling as the balance sheet, right? Because, again, those fields can look at financial health, they can look at operational health, they can look at logistical health, but we haven't really been able to look at our workforce health because we haven't had a really good metric to do that. Okay. Well, now we do, and it's all in terms of alignment. Okay. And how misaligned are we as an organization? Wow, we have X percent misalignments across the board, and here's that percentage by department. Holy cow, that's an entirely different way. And now we can solution based on that, because you can't improve what you can't measure. This is really good sort of lean principles, process, optimization type things, but applied to people sciences, applied on the workforce side. And we can get that same lift that we get in those other fields.
Awesome.
On Friday nights at 9, are you ever like, how does the world not know about this yet?
Yeah, Friday nights at 9 is a scary place in my mind. Or there's
Mark,
it's one of those two extremes.
Oh man, we could continue forever. I really do want to commit to having you back, because I think what our listeners would benefit from are examples of where you've applied this. And I know you work with Fortune 50s, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 startups. It applies across the board. But we've gone long today. But can I convince you to come back?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. If somebody wants to get a hold of you to learn more about this stuff, how would they do that?
They can, we've got a couple different websites to go to, but if somebody wants to email me directly, I am mpalmer@hire-direction.com.
HIRE-direction.com.
That's correct.
That's awesome. And we've talked about the GMI, the Growth Multiplier Index. It's an index that we use to datatize, right, roles and people and create that fit. If you want to experience that, you can reach out to either Chris or myself, and we can hook you up and give you an experience of the process and what it's like, and maybe even help you interpret it a little bit. But we're really enthusiastic about the science, enthusiastic about applying it. So put us to the test. Mark, thank you so much for being with us today. It was great. It was fabulous. Chris, always good to see you and talk to you and have you on the show. This has been Moving the Rock. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, take good care.
Let's do it again, guys.
That'd be awesome.